And so the challenge was, can we simulate, go back to discretionary access control, can we simulate it with the administrative model without using the delegation model? And so the first thing to recognize is this concept of ownership or control is present in all discretionary models. And the ownership has an administrative flavor to it, okay? At least relational databases, when you grant, you have the possibility of saying with grant option, so you can give somebody also the permission to grant. So we have to deal with ownership and we have to deal with granting. He's looked at DAC with change of ownership, but I won't talk about that today. So I had an older paper where we took a relational database and produced with traditional permissions done with grant and revoke statements, a pre-RBAC relational database. And what we did was create a role for each user with all the permissions that had been granted to them, collapse cycles if they're duplicates, and that was the role graph. Okay. Now, it didn't deal with ownership and it didn't deal with granting. And so partly it was to go back and figure out how to deal with it with this new model, with the administrative domains. So suppose you have this company and there are applications that you're using, but people have their individual files. They have their letters that they're writing and so on. And so each person is the owner of their own files, right? And so potentially every single user is an owner of something, okay? And so again, because the privileges relate to specific objects, this implies that we need an owner role in the administrative part of the graph for every user. So that's clearly not a good solution. So what about parameterized roles? Well, if you keep track of the owner of the object, so for each object you just add another attribute which has either a single owner or a set of owners. When the users activate the owner role, their user ID is used to just, again, instantiate the objects that they have control over with whatever permissions it is that you want to put in this owner role. So, given then that we have a single parameterized owner role instead of an owner role for each user, how do we compare? So what kind of metric do we use to compare this with the previous approach from Sandhu and Munawer? So the upper bound on the number of roles is the number of permissions, or maybe the number of users. So you could argue that, well, the role design may have a longer life than the users who come and go from a company. So we'll focus on the privileges in the role design rather than the users. And it's an upper bound because not every access mode may be relevant for every object. So different kinds of objects have different kinds of access modes. We could just have one role, but that's not very useful. So the right answer is somewhere in between, right? And this is still a controversial area that's still sort of, we were discussing last year at SACMAN. So we've decided to measure the number of roles we end up with divided by the number of permissions or privileges. So the original Sandhu and Munawer construction for general liberal DAC actually adds 4 roles for every permission, which is huge. Okay? Having parameterized owner roles adds 1. So we've got a huge improvement there. Now, how do we deal with granting? When a user gets a permission with grant option, they become a potential grantor. Okay? And so we'll distinguish between grantable permissions and ordinary permissions. And just represent that by a Boolean. And so then we have to deal with, at least for relational databases, this statement from SQL, which has a couple of versions. So you can grant a subset of the access modes on a table either to a list of users or to all or to a single user, and you can say with grant option. So I'll just explain the solution with a few examples. So here we're using bold italics to indicate grantable permissions. And so the marketing manager has been assigned to this role which has grantable permissions. So they're a potential grantor. And so over in the administrative part here we have a role called grantor. And what that allows the marketing manager to do, and so this green thing over here is in the group graph, but we really haven't got anything else to show you about the group graph. If the marketing manager then wants to grant all their permissions, so these are all the SQL permissions here, on a table T to somebody else with grant option, well, all of those permissions are represented here by this role. So somehow I have to arrange for the assistant manager to be assigned to that role. And because they're also getting grant option, okay, all of that stuff is currently represented by the role assignments of the marketing manager. And so in the group graph, we just assign the assistant manager to be a subgroup of the marketing manager, and then they're also assigned to the grantor role, and so they have all those permissions with grant option. Okay? So that's one easy solution. If you're going to assign a subset of the permissions, then because you're so what we do in the construction is that any role with grantable permissions is made a domain ID. So we create a domain for that. And then what the person assigned to this can do is they can create a subrole within the domain. Okay? And so they create a role with precisely the right permissions. And it says with grant options, so they've got the grantable flag turned on. And we assign the user to that role and also to the grantor role because they have the grant option. And then if you're going to assign regular permissions, just insert and select on table T to Sue, then the subrole you create has regular permissions and you assign Sue to it and she's not assigned to the grantor role. So to summarize then, to improve on our previous construction, you would look at the DAC system, create the parameterized owner role, the grantor role, in the administrative part of the role graph, assign all the owners to the owner role, make it, add an attribute to all the permissions so you can see whether or not they're grantable, create the roles as we did before, and any role that's got grantable permissions is made a domain ID. And when the grant statement is issued, if there isn't already a role with the right package of permissions, then you create one. And because you're assigned to an administrative role, you have administrative privileges over that domain that you've created. Well, what does this do with the complexity? Well, we end up possibly creating a role for every combination of permissions issued in a grant statement. So it's somewhat incomparable with the other construction. So it's a function of the amount of granting you've done rather than a function of the number of permissions. So it's different. Some of our work we talk about design time versus run time. So at design time you should be designing the graph. So if this is all done at design time, you don't really need to be using, anyway, DAC, maybe quite so much. Okay, so we've also done some work on delegation, and the only thing I'm going to talk about today is, so I'm originally a database person, so if we go back to the early 70s, we were confronted with database packages that were called network databases that had very bizarre semantics, and hierarchical databases, which look a lot like XML databases, but nobody will say that. And